You know, I did talk loud, didn't I? Okay. Well, we're off to a smooth start this morning. And that's the high point so far. It's all downhill from here. You know, we often say that, and you hear us say it over and over and over again, that church is a family you belong to, a people you belong to, and not a place you go. Well, this weekend we had an illustration of that. Y'all know Crystal Thompson? You probably don't. A lot of you don't know Crystal. Crystal is the lady over here that takes care of our babies. And yesterday, her and her daughter were in a car wreck. And the lady ran a red light, took off the front end of Crystal's vehicle. They're fine. She's bruised up. The daughter doesn't feel anything and normal. Has natural airbags deployed and everything like that. Well, before somehow Mindy Himmel is connected to every human being in a 50-mile radius. And one of her friends saw Crystal, knew that Crystal was here, and knew that Mindy was here, and called Crystal. Well, and then Rita, the busybody, goes to figure out what's going on. What's that? Oh, yeah, you're welcome. I meant that in a very sweet, warm way. But anyway, so she goes, and so, Crystal's not alone. And that's how the family of God works. But I want to tell you a story about Crystal. If you get in a car wreck, I will praise you from the pulpit, okay? But anyway, Crystal was in this wreck and everything like that. And it reminded me of a story. We had water night over here a few weeks ago, and that was for Awana and everything like that. And I got real tickled at water night. Levi, the grandchild of Rita and Robbie, they were over there, and Crystal was on the other side of them, and Levi comes running up, and I think it was Robbie, bent down to pick Levi up. Levi scoots right past him and runs to Crystal and jumps in Crystal's lap. Church is a family you belong to. I say that for a couple of reasons. Crystal takes care of our babies, and our babies know it. They're secure, they're happy, and they're loved. And I say that to assure you parents that's what takes place over there, that they are truly loved, and everybody that works over there loves those kids. But that's why we're a church. And that's what church is a family. Now, we're a family on mission. There's no question about that, and we're going to talk about some of that today. But there's something about love that just transcends everything else. The other thing I want to mention to you, Martin, Tyler is not here today. He's on vacation. And so we want to pray for him, for their travels, and that he rest and that he and his family rejuvenate and bond. I never, ever got on people that took vacations and took their family with them, and spent time alone and recharged their batteries and stuff like that. Very valuable times for couples and for families to be together. And so you pray for Tyler and Lindsay that the cares of the world will disappear this week. And they'll just enjoy each other and enjoy those boys, and those boys will remember it as much as they can remember it. We're going to talk about Solomon today. And Solomon is a two-part story. The first part of the story is much better than the second part of the story. And we're going to talk about the good part today. There is no man who was greater on the earth as a king than Solomon in multiple levels. But there's also no bigger failure on the planet than Solomon. This week we talk about the successes. And we start with a story. And you know the story. It's about the two prostitutes who both had children, and one had taken the other in. And one night, one prostitute rolled over and laid on her baby, and her baby suffocated and died, or we suppose that it suffocated and died. And so the one that killed her baby went and got the other baby and swapped babies and contended that this baby was hers. Well, you can imagine the consternation on the part of the innocent party in that deal. And so they appealed to Solomon. And Solomon, anyway, he resolved the situation. He listened to both sides, and he says, well, I have a solution. What we'll do is we'll get a sword and we'll cut the baby in half. That's a solution, I guess, but in his wisdom, he knew that the mother, the real mother, would do anything she could to preserve that baby's life. And that's how he knew. Those stories spread around. But that was just typical. Solomon was so great and so important. If you look in 1 Kings 3, that's where the rise ruling. But if you go to 1 Kings 4, we talk about more of his wisdom. In 429, it said, God made Solomon very wise. His understanding couldn't even be measured. It was like the sand of the seashore. People can't measure that either. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and it was greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. And Solomon was wiser than anyone else. And it mentioned some other characters there that were considered to be the very, very wise. And he became famous in all the nations around him. And he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and he wrote 1,005 songs. He spoke about plants. He knew everything about them, from the cedar trees in Lebanon to the hyssop plant that grow out of walls. He spoke about animals and birds, and he also spoke about reptiles and fish. The king of all the world's nations heard about how wise Solomon was, so they sent people to listen to him. I mean, this guy was amazing. He was unbelievably wise in his judgments and his proclamations, and people would just go sit in court and listen to him and hear how he resolved these cases and the insight that he brought and the understanding that he brought. But he was also very, very well educated. Now, one of the things that he knew all about botany, he knew all about zoology, he knew about nature, he understood he had all the knowledge at his command. Of course, being king, he would do that. He would have books, and these other guys that would come in, I would imagine when they would have these exchanges and talk back and forth, he would try to pull up. The one thing I've discerned about wise people, if they come across somebody who they think knows more than they do, they just pump them with questions. There was a guy, I worked offshore, and I worked offshore, but also I worked my way through college as a roughneck and roustabout, worked on all rigs and drilling rigs and also workover rigs. And one day we were out of Tucson, Louisiana, which is south of where I lived, and we heard the superior of the oil company, the president of the company was coming out to visit our rig. So anyway, the company man who was in charge of the region brought this other guy out, and this other guy was completely unimpressive. I mean, he was just a normal guy. He acted like he didn't know his way around a workover rig. He would ask questions. He talked to different guys, and he came to me. Now listen, my oil field experience was about a year total with everything that I had done up to this point, maybe a year, because I just worked summers, and I'd worked 3 or 4 summers, and I wasn't a worm. A worm is a new guy in the oil field. I wasn't a worm, but I wasn't exactly an experienced hand. And he started asking me all these questions. And I got the impression, this guy doesn't know anything, man. What is he doing out here? And I didn't know he was the president of the company. And so I answered him as best I could, and I just had to say I don't know on a lot of that stuff, you know. But of course, I had an opinion about things and stuff. But anyway, so after he left, I went to the tool pusher, who was a good friend of my dad's, and I said, what is that guy? I mean, he is a real dummy. He just grinned real big because that was the president of the company. I said, how did he get that position? He said, because he asks a lot of questions and he listens a lot. And that's real wisdom. And he'd made all his decisions based upon the feedback that he got. I would imagine Solomon was one of those guys that when he had these exchanges, he would pick up as much as he would give out. So he was known to be wise. The second thing is he was an unbelievable king as an administrator and fulfilling his responsibilities. And if you look in 1 Kings 4:25, it said, when Solomon was king, Judah and Israel lived in safety. They were secure from Dan all the way to Beersheba. Everyone had their own vine and their own fig tree. Now, what that verse says is there was no external threats to Israel. Israel was completely secure through their whole territory. The other thing that strikes me, understand that every other kingdom that rose up during this time, and at this time, there was no kingdom on the planet that rivaled Israel. But they did not practice conquest. They did not go out and take over cities and besiege them and take them over and ransack them and all that kind of stuff. That was not the way that God's people did their business and the way Solomon did his business. But they had complete peace with all their sister nations and things like that. The other thing is, it said that the verse, which is a strange kind of a verse, that everyone had their own vine and their own fig tree. And what the interpretation of that is that there was internal peace, and the crime rate was low. People got along with each other. People felt personal freedom to do and to live the way they lived. The other thing is Solomon built the temple and the royal palace. It took him 20 years to construct these two buildings. And he used forced labor of the foreigners that lived in the land. And here's a record. Go ahead and put the picture of the temple up. He built a temple. Now, estimates on the temple are, it was not built in a football stadium, okay? But this is for comparison. I think this is the field that the New England Patriots play in. And so if you look at it, it's about 60 yards by about 50 yards, the temple complex. It is quite a massive structure. Some say it's the most expensive building that was ever built. The cost ranges as low as $20 billion, which was kind of an outlier, but most of the estimates said that this building that was that big cost between $150 and $220 billion. That's expensive. I don't know what that is a square foot, but that's a lot. They also, and the palace was humongous and decadent, and he built several palaces. He built a palace of the forest also, and he had other homes that he built for his wives and things. So he did a lot of building of palaces and of course, the temple. Now, most of the materials are good. Many of the materials were gathered by David. These were stockpiled already, and so they had that. They filled in the low places, which means they reclaimed swamps. The wetlands or things like that, they would drain them and reclaim them for farmland. He rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem and made the city more secure. He built up these cities all over the place. And then he built up cities to store things. He built up cities to store his chariots and his horses. They did a lot of community projects, and that he built anything he wanted to build in Jerusalem, Lebanon, and all the territory he ruled over. Now, you remember when the nation of Israel went into the Promised Land the first time, and they took over the Promised Land, and the commandment was either drive out everybody in there, in the land, or kill them, because judgment was upon them. They were an extremely wicked people, and to tolerate these wicked people, these idolaters, would be a negative influence on the nation of Israel. Of course, they could convert and repent of their ways. That were the options that they had, but they were left. Well, Solomon took all these people and forced them into forced labor, and so they're the ones that did the work. No Jews were committed to forced labor. He made those his officers, his army, the captains in the armies, the commanders of the chariots and the chariot drivers. Still others were chief officials in charge of Solomon's projects. There were 550 officials in charge of those who did the work. So that many supervisors oversaw the projects. He also built ships, and he partnered with Hiram. In Hiram's country, they were close to the sea, and they had knowledge, and so they partnered, and Solomon built a fleet, and some of Hiram's sailors and their ships went ahead in partnership with them. So we see a picture of a guy who was in charge of his government. He knew how to administer, he knew how to organize, and he put the government in good shape. And they ruled in a righteous way, and God blessed them. And as far as when it comes to wealth, if you look in the 14th verse of the 10th chapter, it says that Solomon received 25 tons of gold every year. And that didn't include the money brought in by business and trade. It also didn't include the money from the kings of Arabia and the governors of the territories. Now, what was happening is the dominant nation would often be given tribute so that the strong nation wouldn't attack him. And so he received all this money. It doesn't say that he forced them to do that. It just said that they basically bought good relations with Israel. 25 tons of gold is $1.44 billion. Now, King Solomon made 200 large shields hammered out of gold, out of the stuff that came in, and each one weighed 15 pounds. In today's value, each shield would cost $432,000. He also made 300 small shields, and each one weighed about 7.5 pounds. Of course, that's exactly half of the large, so it would be 200,000, and he built 300 of those. So you can do your math and add a couple of zeros. And they had a lot of money invested in shields. He also made a very large throne. You want to put the picture of the throne up, guys? Any king would need a throne, and so he built a large throne. It was covered with ivory, and that was covered with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps. Its back had a rounded top. The throne had armrests on both sides of the seat. A statue of a lion stood on each side of the throne. 12 lions stood on the 6 steps. And there was one at each end of the step. Nothing like that throne had ever been made for any other kingdom. Now, when it came to Bling, Solomon was the king of Bling. And you can see that, and how much gold and how much that thing cost, who knows. It said all the cups of Solomon were made out of gold. All things used in the palace of the forest of Lebanon was made of pure gold. Nothing was made out of silver. When Solomon was king, silver was considered to be not worth very much. In other words, it was useless. It was worthless. It was not a precious thing because the wealth was so many. And again, it said he had many ships. He was richer than all the other kings of the earth, and he was also wiser than them. People from all whole world wanted to meet Solomon in person. They wanted to see for themselves how wise God made him. And year after year, everyone came to him, brought a gift. They brought gifts made out of silver and gold. They brought robes, weapons, spices. They also brought horses and mules. He had 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horses during this time. He said he was richer than any other king on the earth. Estimated wealth of Solomon, of course, who knows? I mean, I know these guys research this and study it and look at all this stuff, but evidently Solomon was worth about $1 trillion. So he would put our modern day, rich guys he would put them down pretty bad because he was that outstanding in that way. I thought it was mentioned that he brought in ivory and everything else on these ships, and even brought in apes. So really, when you stop and compare Solomon and how great he was and how effective he was, there's really nobody that can compare to his influence during this time or much of any other time. And this was the highlight. Now, what was the keys to his success? Why did they live in peace? Why were they secure? Why was the crime rate low? Why did they have such wealth, and why did they prosper? Well, and I think the first thing is that he had good advisors and a very good role model in his dad. And David says in 1 Kings 2, I'm about to die, just as everyone else on earth does. So be strong. Show how brave you are. Show yourself to be a man, is what one version says. Now, speculation is, and I read commentaries, and they said, why did he tell him to be a man? Well, J. Vernon McGee said he was a sissy. But I don't know if that was the case. But what was the case, though, is unlike his father David, who was an outdoorsman, he had killed a lion, the bear, Goliath. Solomon was a man of peace. He was raised in the palace. He was pampered his whole life. Decisions were made for him. And now, so his dad says, stand up on your hind legs and you be a man. Those of you who had a good, godly man who was a man as a father knows the benefit of having a man. My dad was one of those guys, and he was very strict with us when we were young, very supportive, helped us learn how to work and do all that kind of stuff. And I recall so many of the things that he told us. One of the things he told me about being a man is when you're a man and you take a stand, don't look around to see if anybody else is standing with you. You stand and don't back down. And that's what David was telling his son Solomon. Do the right thing. Stand up. He says, do everything the Lord your God requires. Live the way he wants you to. Obey his orders and commands. Keep his laws and rules. Do everything written in the law of Moses. Then you will have success in everything you do. You will succeed everywhere you go. Who are your role models? Who do you look up to? Who do you seek for advice and counsel? Who do you consult? Do you consult scholars of the day, or do you ask good, godly people who pray? I remember a girl told me one time, said, my dad always said, if you want to know what God thinks, go to a man who prays and talk to him. I ask guys questions a lot when I was director of missions, and still do today. And it's one of the first questions I ask them. Who are the influencers in your life? Who is it that took time with you and came to you and encouraged you and lifted? Who are your role models? You gain a lot of information and insight from the people who they look to or who we look to. And it's funny, as I look back at those guys that influenced me, I can see their effect. There was a guy named Ray West, and I mentioned to him before, and I went in to visit with him when I was living in Mississippi, and I came to visit with him, and he was in the back, and his wife said, Ray just is so proud of you. He comes out and saying, when he reads your newsletter, he said, that's what I would have done. That's what I would have done. Well, the reason I did it is because of his influence in my life. And he was a godly man. He was a man of the word. Who influences you? Who do you go for counsel? And it doesn't necessarily have to be an older, younger. It just has to do with life experience and people's close walk with God. We always need to do that. Second thing is, he realized he was on the throne as a result of God's choice. Solomon answered in the third verse, in verse 6. He said, you have been very kind to my father David, your servant. That's because he was faithful to you. It's not a throne they're sitting on, it's a cell they're sitting in. Or they're sitting in really tough situations just because they made a decision to follow Christ. The point is that our purpose in that place is to magnify God and communicate his message wherever we are. But understand that there's no accidents. Now, if you've in jail because you robbed a liquor store, then you got what you deserved. But even then, God could redeem that. They're called field ministers, and they're basically inmate chaplains that are in our prisons. And there was one story of one guy that he was giving his testimony, and he's there for the rest of his life, and he's about maybe mid-30s. He'll never get out. And he said, I want to thank God, and I'm so grateful to God, and I praise God as I sit here today. And I thought, now this is pretty good coming from a guy who has no hope of parole or anything else like that. And David has seen a bunch of these guys that get, and he says, because in this place where there's anger, where there's nothing, God has given me purpose, and he's given me hope. You see, because our circumstances, where we are, doesn't determine our attitude, and it doesn't determine our presence. Because you can be in a cell in Philippi where Paul was, and you can sing praises to God when you realize that God has a purpose and can redeem any circumstance or situation. Next thing is that he was, okay, the next thing is that he acknowledged his limitations. In the verse 7, he says, you have made me king, you have put me in my place of my father David, but I am only a child. I don't know how to carry out my duties. You know a statement I really detest? It is one of the biggest lies that's perpetrated in Christian circles today, that God won't put on you anything that you can't handle. You ever heard that? That is a bold. I want to tell you something. Everything that God will ever ask any of us to do is beyond our capacity or ability to do. You can't do it. That's the whole point of why we have the Holy Spirit. That's the whole point about see, God desires a loving, as Henry Black said, a loving relationship with us. He wants to commune with us and fellowship with. He wants us to be a people who belong to him, and he belongs to us. That family aspect. Did we get the church? We didn't get the church aspect of being family that you belong to from us. It's from God. It is God. He sent his son to redeem man to himself. He wants that fellowship. And he uses our circumstances. We're like sheep for the slaughter, sheep among wolves. I mean, sheep don't have a whole lot of defensive mechanisms except to turn their backside to whatever the predator is and hope that he eats some of the sheep. So God puts stuff on us all the time and says, son, daughter, this is bigger than you, but I'm with you. Go and make disciples, and lo, I will be with you always. And that's a great gift. Now, I think that verse is a distortion. It said that when we enter into temptation, there'll be no temptation that will come to us that he will not provide a way of escape. But even our way out of temptation is brought on by God himself and an escape from that. We are weak. We are sinners. We need mercy. We need grace. and he gives it. And he gave it to Solomon. Solomon also believed that he was a servant of God and of the people. Solomon, in his early ministry or his early reign, practiced the great commandment to love God with all his heart, mind, and soul, and to love his neighbor as himself. He invested in people, and he worshiped God. It said that he went to the high place, and what that was a reference to is that he practiced worship. But that since there was no temple, they would just use a hill and build an altar. But on that same hill, pagan gods were also worshipped. So the influence was too close, it was the condemnation there. But he led the nation in his early days in worship. We're going to talk about next week what happened to him and what happened to that kind of stuff and how he went wrong. And he said, I am here among the people, it's the 8th verse, you have chosen. They're a great nation. They are more than anyone can count. So give me a heart that understands that I can rule over your people and I can tell the difference between what is right and what is wrong. Who can possibly rule over this great nation of yours? And so he asked to benefit God and to benefit why? Because he was a child. Because who can rule over those people? You know, when I do that, I think of the responsibility that God has given you parents to raise your kids. How in the world are you going to raise your kids up in the world that we live in today, with all the negative influences, with all the threats that are out there, with all the false, ungodly thinking that is out there? How do you do that? Well, the questioning you have, the uncertainty you have, that's exactly what Solomon faced. How in the world can I lead these people? And the question he had was, he asked for wisdom. And if you look in verse 10, it said the Lord was pleased that Solomon asked for that. So God said to him, you have not asked to live a long life, which is what they wanted to do. You have not asked to be wealthy. You have not even asked to have your enemies killed. Instead, you ask for wisdom. You want to do what is right and fair when you judge people, because that is what you have asked for. I will give it to you. I will give you a wise and understanding heart. So here is what will be true for you, of you. There will never be anyone like you, and there never will. There has never been anyone like you, and there never will be. And that is not all. I will give you what you have not asked for. I will give you wealth and honor. As long as you live, no other king will be as great as you are. And God lived up to those. Why? Because his priorities were right. At the beginning of his ministry, he valued what God valued. He adopted God's values as his own. When we do that, when we honor God and we walk close to him, we naturally influence others. You've heard me say before about this evangelist that said when we walk with Jesus, we do more by accident than we ever plan to do on purpose. Because it's God who works in and through and around us. So our challenge is to walk closely with God. Next, we talk about Solomon's failure next week. The question I have for you today is, how will you finish? What is going to be said about you in history? The prescription that was followed here, that Solomon knew he was a child. And because of that, because of his needs, he asked God for wisdom. And because he asked for wisdom and didn't ask for anything else, he just asked for others, God blessed him in an incredible way. I am not saying that if you pray the prayer of Solomon that you're going to be wealthy. You probably won't be, although wealth is a relative thing. But I will say this, you will benefit others. You'll live a life that is worthy. You will hear, well done, good and faithful servant. I really wish we could stop the story right here and we didn't have to go on with it about his failure. And next week we're going to talk about Solomon's downfall, what brought him down, but also the path toward redemption that God has provided when we do fall down. Let me ask you a question. What's your priorities? What is important to you? What is important to you is what you pass on to your neighbors and your friends and your children. Because you can't hide it. I mean, you can talk about it, You can talk about my priority is to be the most fit human being on the planet, to eat the right diet. And I can talk diet all day and exercise all day, but if I don't get out and live it, if I don't prove it by my hours, how many hours, and how much I think about it, It doesn't work. How do you spend your money? What's a priority? You say something about yourself on how you spend money. If you just spend it on yourself and don't give it to others, you don't share with the church, you don't share with people in need, that says something about you. You can say, I love people and I want to help people, but if you don't give them your money, your time, your energy, your thoughts, you don't. And so often we have some of that. You know, I come across guys that are mentoring and stuff, and they said, I just don't have time. And so one of the things that the tools we used was we would do a time log over the course of a week. And they would just be like on Monday, you know, from midnight to midnight. And I'd ask them to put in each one of those slots what they did and when they did, and did a time log, and to do that for a week. And then the total number of minutes that they spend in those things. In every case, the guys that didn't have time, it was devastating how much time they wasted doing nothing, accomplishing nothing. We have time, and our values, our priorities, the influence of our counselors will determine. Now, some of you come in today, and well, we all come in today with circumstances in our lives that are challenging, or difficult, or very rewarding and very fulfilling. How are you going to use that to benefit other people? Remember that we talked about the great commandment to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. So what we do is in His interest. But we also love our neighbor as ourselves. What are you going to do to benefit your neighbor? What are you going to do to help them? It may inconvenience you, but you do that. I don't know how many people are in the room, but the life experience that's in this room is truly amazing. In this room, the highs and the lows of life. You know, one of the things that Satan always tries to tell you is you're the only person that's going through what you're going through. Tries to do it to isolate you. The truth is you're not. It may not be exactly the same thing, but we all have circumstances. The Bible says what we forgive on earth is forgiven in heaven. We need to develop relationships. We do that through our small group ministry. Develop relationships that are deep enough where we can really talk about hard issues. That third level communication where we say, I am really struggling with X. I'm really struggling with anger. I'm really struggling with jealousy. I'm really struggling with drugs. I'm really struggling with, and those things that hinder you from being a fully committed, a fully following follower of Jesus Christ. But that's why God put us together, to help us. Because Satan will try to get you to do bad stuff. And then when you do the bad stuff, he'll try to make you feel bad about it. Where God wants to give you cleanness, and He wants to give you deliverance from the bad stuff. Who are you invested in? Who are you involved with? It's never too late to ask God for His provision. I don't know what you need. Some people say, well, I'm going too far. I've done too much. I'm too old. And that's all the lies of Satan. Because He is the great Redeemer. That thief on the cross, some of his last breaths he took, and he found life. Eternal, abundant life. And God extends that to you. We're going to have an invitation. I want you to bow your heads and close your eyes. I think that everyone in this room, if we're thinking about it and if we're aware that, can think of a need, an area. I may have mentioned it. I may not have. I know a lot of you parents, you share the feelings of those kids. Would you ask for wisdom if you need wisdom? Patience if you need patience? Realize that you're a child and that you can't overcome that circumstances by just your will. And understand that there is a God in heaven who loves you, who knows the circumstances of your situation more than you do, better than you do. And that He's a God who has a solution. His name's Jesus. Let's stand.